This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to The Commercial Investing Show, where we analyze, explain, and exploit the opportunities presented in today's commercial property marketplace. If you're interested in apartments, mobile home parks, self-storage facilities, and other income property, you've come to the right place. We'll explore what's hot and what's not in markets nationwide in the relentless pursuit of return on investment. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
Thank you for joining us today for part 2 of the last episode. See, one of the things people really have to realize about interest rates, people talk about rates going up 1%. Well, that 1% could be 20%. It's not 1%. It's compared to where it was. That's how you have to look at it. The typical rule is every 1% in interest rate equals 10% in purchase price. Okay, so that same property, if it's a $1 million property in Los Angeles, it's $100,000 swing for each 1% in either direction, approximately. It's not exact. People buy houses on a payment, not a price. So it's so funny how the economists look at this stuff, Richard. They say, oh, well, house prices have gone up this much or that much. Well, yeah, but the question is, what has the payment on that house done based on the mortgage rate? That everyone buys the house on the payment. Yeah, they all look at the prices and talk about the prices and say, oh, prices are so high. But really what they're buying on is a payment. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree.
Same way they buy a car. Okay, so talk to us about some of the other things on your list here.
Well, just about the course correction that you mentioned earlier. Yes, so if the stock market falls another 10% from here, I think the Fed will pause its tightening. Mm-hmm. It will stop hiking the federal funds rate, and it will put the quantitative tightening on pause as well. Uh-huh. And if the market falls 20% from here, then the U.S. economy is going to start moving back into recession. Uh-huh. And at that point, the Fed would probably cut rates again. If the recession becomes severe enough, they'll launch another round of quantitative easing and push everything back up again. So yes, everyone needs to understand that the government, and in particular the Fed, is managing the economy primarily by pushing up asset prices. And they will do their best to make sure they don't fall too radically.
Why do they feel they need to do this? Why do they feel they need to tighten it? From hearing you talk, it sounds like you feel that they're overreacting. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think they're overreacting. I actually pity the Fed. They're in a situation now where if they don't tighten, then a big bubble will form. Stocks prices in particular, right. And as you mentioned, in all the property in the trophy cities, there are already massive bubbles. The stock market on a cyclically adjusted PE multiple has only been higher than this twice in history, in 1929 and at the time of the NASDAQ bubble. Mm-hmm. So if they don't tighten, then these bubbles are going to run completely out of control, and when they pop, they're going to wreck the financial system again. So the Fed needs to tighten, but it knows that if it tightens too much, then these inflated prices will crash, and that will wreck the economy. Mm-hmm. They'll try not to allow that to happen.
Yeah, right. So no Fed chair wants the recession to occur on their watch. No president wants it to occur on their watch. How does the new Tax Reform Act play into this? You mentioned it before, but I'm particularly interested in the concept of American companies giving out bonuses, pay raises, directly, they've stated, because of the new tax law. And also, I'm interested in the concept of repatriation of offshore money by large companies. What are your thoughts?
Well, so essentially, the government is not going to reduce its spending at all. It's going to keep spending.
That never happens.
On the same thing that it has been spending on, and plus some more.
Right.
But the thing that is going to change is that corporations and the very wealthy people will have to pay a lot less money in tax. And so
Does that trickle down?
It does trickle down to some extent. I mean, the rich people will have more shoe shines, and they will hire more gardeners.
Right.
So
if they have to hire more gardeners, they have more houses.
Well, that's right. The thing is, wealthy people are already very wealthy, and they may not spend any more. than they're already spending just because they have a few $1 million more than they had before. But the spending that does occur, much of it, a significant part of it, will go to buying things produced in China. So it will help China's economy, probably just as much as it will help the U.S. economy. But it all comes at the cost of a much larger government debt, $1.5 trillion, between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion. No one really knows. They're saying over the next 10 years, most of it coming sooner rather than later. And the other negative consequence is that because the government is going to be borrowing more, that's going to tend to push interest rates higher. And that will hurt everyone by making the stock market fall and probably property prices fall, but also making credit card bills more expensive and financing for cars and automobiles and homes. So there was justification, I think, for having fiscal stimulus. I think it would have been much wiser and much better for the U.S. economy, instead of increasing the deficit by $1 trillion or more by cutting taxes on corporations and wealthy people. I believe the government should have invested $1 trillion over the next 10 years in new industries.
The first time
and new technologies.
I remember this talk. First time I ever had you on the show years ago, you suggested that the government, and it was during the Great Recession, you suggested that the government spend invest $3 trillion. I think you said $1 trillion for infrastructure, $1 trillion for like biotech, and I don't know, $1 trillion on something else, right? Yeah. Am I quoting you right on that?
That's right. And with this tax cut, they've just wasted $1.5 trillion of that they could have spent in new investments. And I mean, for instance, if the government were to invest $1 trillion in genetic and biotech research over a 10-year period, within 10 years, they could cure cancer and probably Alzheimer's disease and radically expand the productive lifespan of everyone alive. Furthermore, that would have created real jobs in the U.S. economy, trained up and educated the people much more than they are being educated, and it would generally have made the U.S. economy much more productive, creating businesses that would allow us to sell things to other countries in exchange for the low-cost manufactured goods that we're buying from them. So the government should invest and stimulate the economy that way. They will get real benefits. If a government-sponsored corporation invents a cure for cancer, they could list that on NASDAQ for $10 trillion and it would pay for itself many times over. So this tax cut, while it will stimulate the economy, it's wasteful. It's wasting a great opportunity for the government to invest that much money in new industries and technologies, and that way they could make America's economy great again.
To coin a phrase. Richard, how does the government do that, though? I mean, do you really trust the government to spend the money wisely or invest the money wisely? I mean, government doesn't have the greatest track record with that kind of stuff. Through the tax bill, aren't they just letting the companies do that by letting them keep the money, and their tax rate goes down, they can invest that?
Well, do you really trust the corporations? I mean, they all went bankrupt in 2007 and had to be saved by the government.
Well, that's only because they were so highly regulated that they, could get away with all these shenanigans because there was no checks and balances. No new players could come in and compete with Goldman Sachs and Lehman because the regulatory bar was so high. So there is no startup culture on Wall Street. Isn't that mind-boggling that we've got this vibrant startup culture in almost every part of the economy except banking, brokerage? I mean, you've got some fintech and stuff like that, I know, but that's not really startup culture, right? There's not two guys in a garage that are building a great Goldman Sachs, right? There's nothing there because the regulatory hurdle is so high. And I think the best way to keep a check and balance on these disgusting companies on Wall Street and these disgusting banks, Wells Fargo, my God, I have to say, I love that new Fed edict. They can't grow until they stop ripping people off. You read about that, I'm sure, right?
Well, right. So, you're saying they're too heavily regulated, but they weren't regulated enough to prevent them from ripping people off.
No. I'm saying that the best thing is to have the competitors regulate them. But because you don't have that, or at least not very much, hey, you're in it. You're in so deep, you got to now have the heavy hand of the regulators do it, because nobody else is going to keep them in check. I mean, there's not a bunch of other big money center banks to go to. There's like a few of them, right? Anyway, we might go too far afield with my libertarian ethic here, and I don't want to argue about that. But
well, let me give you some examples of why I do think the government can pull off what I've just described.
All right, yeah, that's what I wanted to get to. Sorry.
Just as the government succeeded in sending a man to the moon 40 years ago in their moonshot, there could be an equally successful cancer moonshot.
Okay.
The private sector still hasn't been able to send a man to the moon.
Yeah.
So that's 40 years that government-directed investment accomplished something of enormous importance. Moreover, I'm sure, like everyone else, you have a smartphone, and everything that makes your smartphone smart came from government-funded research.
Yeah, well, the military, I mean, like GPS and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah. Everyone seems very happy about spending $700-800 billion a year on the military for defense. Well, not very many people, not very many Americans have died in wars recently, but hundreds of thousands of Americans die every year from cancer.
Right.
Spending money on medical research is defense. It will keep people alive who otherwise will die.
Yeah.
So just as our military, the government, won World War II and sent a man to the moon, and then through this investment has produced the smartphone, GPS, and of course the internet itself, and just about everything else in the smartphone that makes it smart, it was all from government research, government-funded research.
Yeah.
So yes, the government can invest successfully.
Yeah.
There's no reason the government can't invest just as successfully as the private sector. And so that's what you're seeing to a large extent in China now. I mean, their government is investing very aggressively. They're going to become the dominant players in many of the leading industries over the next 10 to 20 years if their economy doesn't collapse, in part because the government is investing and directing investment there very successfully. So now they dominate the solar panel industry, for instance, and soon also the electric car business. Soon, China is going to no longer need oil because they will have an electric-driven economy, solar-fired.
So does China get any advantage on that kind of stuff by, being technically, although it sort of doesn't look like it a lot of times, a communist country? There's definitely some real efficiencies to being communist. You can just do what you want. If you want to build a road, you just build it and tell everybody to move if they're in the way, right? Are there some advantages there, to admit to with China, and also the fact that they just pollute like crazy, so they don't have much in the way of regulation so that their businesses can grow like that?
Yes, it's not just communism. It's more broadly totalitarianism or authoritarianism, totalitarianism, whether it's on the left or the right. If you have a totalitarian government with absolute control, it's easier to get things done. Of course, it comes at a very high price in terms of individuals having no recourse to government decisions and often suffering on an enormous scale. The Soviet Union was totalitarian and industrialized very rapidly during the 20s and 30s, but millions of people died. But it industrialized so quickly it was able to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II on the back of its totalitarian efforts to industrialize.
Yeah. Is the $3 trillion still the same as it was back then when we talked originally? Is it the same $3 trillion, same direction?
Well, of course, $3 trillion is an arbitrary number.
Yeah.
But yes, I think we need to have, rather than driving up the budget deficit by cutting taxes for people who are already very wealthy and increasing the income inequality in the country, and meanwhile not addressing any of the problems that are causing America to decline relatively to the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, we need to come up with a plan of how we're going to restructure the economy. And we can do that through government investment in new industries on a very large scale.
Well, that's not going to happen under this administration. It didn't happen under the last one. I guess we're left with what is going to happen. I mean, what do you think will happen? What are the next few years going to look like for us? Or have you already addressed that with what you said before?
I think it's too early to say that it won't happen. I think it was Churchill who said, America always does the right thing after it's exhausted every other possibility. So we're running out of options. We're running out of possibilities. And this option makes sense. And ideas that make sense catch on. So we need investment, not just building new roads and bridges. We need investment in nanotechnology and biotech and genetic engineering and renewable energies, to name just a few. And this would rev up the economy, and we can afford to do this. The U.S. government debt is high and getting higher, but it's nowhere near as high as Japan's government debt. In fact, Japan's government debt is 250% of Japan's economy.
It's crazy.
Whereas the U.S. government debt is only 100% of the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
So,
you know what's interesting about that? When we talk about those debt numbers, Richard, they're so scary. But again, there's no real comparison. You got to ask yourself the question, right? Compared to what? And we don't know how high it can go. In other words, what I'm getting at is how far can they kick this can down the road? At what point does it end? Is it indefinite? Maybe you can just kick the can down the road for another 5 decades. I mean, before you have to pay the consequences. Nobody knows. It's uncharted territory, isn't it?
5 decades from now, the people are going to be some sort of genetically modified cyborgs with artificial intelligence and quantum computers.
Yeah.
If they can't take care of themselves, then I don't feel sorry for them.
Right.
We need to think about making sure that our economy and civilization doesn't collapse if this bubble begins to implode. So it's now 2018. They've kicked the can 10 years down the road. That's worked really well for me relative to the depression that we would have suffered through had they not. So if they can keep kicking it for another 30 years, that's going to probably work out just about right for me.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, you might be living a lot longer than you think.
Well, if they invest in medical technologies, then yes, I have the potential to live very much longer than everyone expects.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. It's truly amazing. Well, Richard, are there any questions I didn't ask you? Anything else you wanted to share with the listeners today?
Well, I think the important thing is for your audience to really focus on quantitative tightening. Everyone became very familiar with quantitative easing, and everyone now remembers and recognizes that every round of quantitative easing pushed the stock market much higher and asset prices in general much higher. But what the press is not focusing on enough is what is now quantitative tightening. It is the exact opposite. Before, the Fed was creating money and buying assets. Now they're selling assets and destroying money. This is going to have very bad consequences as long as it persists. And this is not getting enough attention. But you can see already now that they have started destroying $20 billion a month from January, interest rates are moving higher. And in combination with the larger budget deficit that has to be funded, this is putting upward pressure on interest rates, and this isn't going to end anytime soon. So everyone had better buckle in and be prepared for much more volatility in the stock market in the short term. And if the Fed continues hiking, as it has said, and destroys 23% of its balance sheet by the end of next year, then markets are going to go down, stocks and property. And so people had better be prepared for that.
Richard, you have an offer for our audience that you wanted to share, I believe, and give out your website.
My business is I produce a video newsletter called Macro Watch. Every couple of weeks, I upload a new video. It's essentially me making a PowerPoint presentation describing something important going on in the global economy and how that's likely to impact stocks and bonds and property and currencies and commodities. And I sell this on a subscription basis for $500 a year. But I'd like to offer your listeners a 50% discount. So if they visit my website, which is richardduncaneconomics.com, that's richardduncaneconomics.com, they will find a offer to subscribe, hit the subscribe button. They'll then be prompted to put in a coupon code for a discount, 50% discount. So if they use the code GLOBAL, that's global, GLOBAL, they will be able to subscribe for $250 a year. And for that, they will immediately have access to 41 hours of videos that are in the archives that they can begin watching immediately, addressing almost every major subject of importance in the global economy. Plus, they'll get 2 new videos a month for a year ahead. So I hope they'll check it out, or at the very least, go there and sign up for my free blog at richardduncaneconomics.com.
Richard Duncan, thank you so much for joining us.
Jason, thank you. It's always a pleasure talking with you. We're always hitting on some very interesting subjects.
Absolutely. We'll see what happens. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.